Welcome, wanderers. Some of you are just beginning your adventure in the world and works of J.R.R. Tolkien, while others have explored all throughout Middle-earth and beyond many times. If you're a seasoned adventurer, you may have had a chance meeting with my guest for this episode, Larry D. Curtis. I first heard Larry when he was moderating a panel called The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, at FanX in Salt Lake City last fall. From previously writing for theonering.net to starting a podcast called Middle Earth Musings, Larry is a real wandering wizard when it comes to Lord of the Rings lore. Now, Larry, I've heard you describe yourself as not a Tolkien scholar, not a Tolkien linguist, not a Tolkien filmmaker, but rather as a Tolkien journalist. Could you introduce yourself and explain what you mean by you are a Tolkien journalist?
Well, I don't remember saying that, but that was well said. I'm glad I did say that. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate. I have like people do, I have a lifelong kind of love affair with Tolkien. I'm a journalist also, non-Tolkien, and and I just fell into kind of the realm of talking and writing and interviewing and all the things that you do about Tolkien with a lot of people who are those things, are genuinely wizards. In fact, literally wizards, like in McKellen, I guess isn't literally a wizard, but played one. And so I've just had the opportunity to talk to lots and lots of people about Tolkien. I'm kind of a fan of fans. That's another thing I kind of say. And yeah, I've literally reported on Tolkien for decades now. So I think that's fair to say.
Fantastic. What pulls you into Tolkien? What enchants you about his world, his characters, whatever it is? What is it that enchants you from Tolkien's work?
I was exposed as quite a young child to Tolkien. I was given books on a long road trip in a very boring destination at my grandparents' house in Missouri. I was a voracious reader then, and there is a richness and a detail and a depth and a feeling that Tolkien wrote about that I had not encountered before, and maybe haven't quite encountered since. He set the standard for so much of what we read about and think about and experience in fantasy. I say all the time that he changed the world, and I mean that quite literally. And it's hard to define, but the world building that Tolkien did certainly is important and real. And he just established so much of how we think of modern fantasy. So it's definitely that for me. I guess more than anything, to really answer your question without going on and on. It's just the feeling of the depth that Tolkien managed to create, so that it isn't just about the story that I'm in or enjoying now, but it's about the feeling that it's so much more, that it's real history, even though clearly it's real fantasy. And that sort of world building, that level, is what really sort of soothes my soul or draws me to Tolkien.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that for sure. If you could articulate what that feeling is that soothes your soul, what would you say that is?
Well, people now definitely less than maybe even 20 years ago, but definitely less than 50 years ago, um, take fantasy a little more seriously than they used to, right? And I would say that's grown, and partially because of Tolkien, but also because of things that came after, like Star Wars and Harry Potter and lots of things. Um, but Tolkien wrote about how fantasy was a bit of an escape from the real world, and that wasn't a terrible thing. If we're in a prison, we want to escape from that, and the real world is hard. uh, you know, that's just how it is every day, and maybe not every day, but many days. And Tolkien provides that realism and that depth, that soothing of the soul in a way that it feels so genuine and important. And he had something to say, lots of things to say, and so that is a nice diversion from real life. But I do want to add that when I say escape, and I think when Tolkien did, and when I talk about soothing of the soul, that doesn't mean we leave real life behind, right? And if in a fantasy reading or Tolkien or isn't making life better when we're not reading Tolkien, then probably it's not worthwhile. But it's a little escape. It's a vacation or a diversion. It is certainly not meant to lose our balance or make Tolkien more important than the real world. But it's a nice little diversion, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. It has a ring of truth to it. So like you can escape kind of that real world, but almost so that you could look at the world with a different lens. You take a theme like friendship in the Lord of the Rings, and you can look at, well, who's friends with who, and what does it mean to be an actual true friend? Everybody needs a friend like Sam, right? So in the one way, you are escaping the world, but on the other side, it's like maybe if I don't have a friend like Sam, I need to go find a friend that can be like a Sam to me. So I think yes, there is some element of escapism, but also just a different perspective of looking at the real world and finding some truths about the human experience there in Tolkien for sure.
I think you articulated that. Like you just said what I wish I had said. I absolutely agree with that. It is a way to so fantasy, and it's even horror films, it's even zombie films, it's all those things. They really do allow us to look at our own world, our own lives, our own experiences, because they're sometimes so different. It's a really good way to kind of examine those things. And I think Tolkien's definitely that. Like friendship is a theme, loyalty is a theme, sacrifice is a theme, sadness is a
Right.
theme as well,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
Like that the sadness in Tolkien, but it serves a purpose, and it's beautiful, and it allows us to examine our own sadness sometimes that way. I definitely agree with what you said. It's it's a good way to kind of understand our own human experience, even though it's elves and dwarves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in one of your podcast episodes, you made a bold claim, which was that Tolkien is the author of the 20th century, and you've actually alluded to this a little bit before in your earlier comments. But in what ways do you think Tolkien has impacted our culture? Why is he the author of the 20th century?
Well, I wish I could claim that was my original idea, but there is a book called Tolkien, the Author of the Century, written in back in the 20th century. But
Okay,
um,
I didn't know
he,
that.
yeah, I mean he like I just said a minute ago, he changed the world, and that is no light claim. It's almost impossible to find things in pop culture um, that aren't traceable to Tolkien. And George R. R. Martin, who not coincidentally by booksellers are named after J.R.R. Tolkien, said it better than anyone. So I'm going to paraphrase him. But if you studied Japanese paintings, which I don't, but if you did, it might be of the ocean, it might be of a cart or a horse or a warrior or a flower. Very, very often in the background of that painting is Mount Fuji. And so the painting is not of that, but Mount Fuji looms large. And Martin said that that's what Tolkien is like in fantasy literature.
Mm,
That you
yeah.
you can paint whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. But in the background somewhere is Tolkien, kind of overseeing or casting his shadow, and so that's true. So Star Wars is a really easy example because everyone knows Star Wars, right? But Ben Kenobi, the wise wizard, owes a lot to Gandalf. Um, and the bad guys own a lot to Sauron, the Dark Lord, the Sith Lord Vader, the Dark Lord. It's
Hmm.
easy to make
Yep.
those, and Harry Potter the same way. Tolkien established, in fact, a dragon is a super easy example. When people talk about dragons, they think of certain things, and nearly all of those things apply to Smaug. Uh, and
Right.
it's
Hmm.
so prevalent, it's so pervasive in our kind of culture and how we think about dragons that we don't really realize like how much that actually is owed to Tolkien because it's just the normal. But anyone who's ever played a Dungeons and Dragons game or all the things that even spawned from there, um, you can trace it back to Tolkien. Not to say that he invented fantasy, but he did it. He wrote it and presented it in a way that it overwhelmed what we think of fantasy and all the kind of the tropes and all the arcs and the characters that came after. It's just really traceable to him. And there's some great fantasy that came before, and there's an awful lot of great fantasy that came after. But he is Mount Fuji. He's just looms so large. Lord of the Rings looms so large in that landscape. It's just inescapable. So when he wrote those things, when he published, mid-century, fantasy was thought of in an entirely different way than it is now, and he influenced in a massive way films, television, games. I mean, probably Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't exist
Hmm.
without Tolkien. And
Yeah.
there's so many games that exist because Dungeons and Dragons happened, right? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know how you calculate that influence. I don't know that you can, but it's massive. And the same, you could talk about film, you can talk about books. He wrote 3 books. That's just the norm. A
Right.
trilogy of books is just kind of how it is. Well, why? Because he established those
Hmm.
parameters.
Hmm.
So if you write 5 books or 7, you've kind of broken the mold. Well, the mold exists because Tolkien wrote a trilogy, and he put maps in his books, and he put,
Yes.
illustrations in his books. It's all those things. And I don't even think I'm very well capable of articulating it, but that's my attempt.
Yeah, I love that you say that, and you brought up maps, and I remember reading Tolkien as a kid, and maps became like my barometer for, is this a good fantasy tale or not? Because Tolkien had maps and it was great. And if you had a fantasy book without a map, it was like, I'm not going to give you my time, because Tolkien gave me maps, and I loved checking out the maps.
Me too.
So I think you've also mentioned you spent some time on the set of the Hobbit movies. Those came out, oh, I don't know, what's been 10, 15 years now, maybe.
Some
Uh,
frightening amount of time because it
yes,
seems like
yes,
yesterday to me.
it does. Tell us a little bit about, uh, number one, how do you get wrangled onto being able to be part of the set of The Hobbit? And then what was it like there? What did you do?
Uh, Part one, I mean, I don't know how big or small of an answer you want is the problem. I was a journalist with a high degree of interest in Tolkien, and I don't know how many of your readers can cast their mind back to like 1999, but um, there was some movies being made, being filmed, shot
Hmm.
in New Zealand of all places, which admittedly I barely understood what New Zealand
Hmm.
was at the time.
Hmm.
They literally, the films that I'm talking about literally helped put New Zealand on the map in a literal way for many people in their heads. So anyway, 1999, the internet was very young, and fandom was um, fandom was not young, but online fandom was still
Yes.
kind of young.
Hmm.
So this website called theonering.net, I stumbled upon it back in those days, and it became not only my source for news about these movies, but everyone's. And the movie studio had no idea what to do with that, and the filmmakers had no idea what to do with that. And someone who I'm now fortunate enough to call a friend, her name's Erica. She lives in New Zealand. She's pretty adventurous. She's a tough, like she has the Kiwi spirit. She's like the prototypical Kiwi awesome person. And
Hmm.
she started to figure out like, where could they be filming this or where could they be filming that? Um, and she, in fact, she played for the New Zealand Symphony in those days. And somebody, not her, snuck into a quarry site and took some pictures and sent them to the One Ring, and the One Ring released them. Well, the production, not understanding, and by the way, it was, Hollywood still, right? They didn't
Hmm.
understand fandom. They served her with a trespass notice
Oh
that
no.
she had trespassed, but she had airtight alibi that she wasn't even in the city. She was in Auckland, I think, playing with the New Zealand Symphony.
Mm.
Well, that made news in New Zealand, like national news, and then it made world news. And suddenly they had a PR problem.
Uh-oh.
Like, what are we going to do? And so Erica was then treated really well, and the OneRing.net was treated really well, and she was invited to come meet the filmmakers. So that was 99. By the time the first Lord of the Rings movie rolled out, The Fellowship of the Ring, I had then talked to the people at the One Ring and offered to help, being a journalist and a writer and understanding news. I was still just kind of loosely associated, but there was an Oscar party that year where I met Erica, where I met other people from the One Ring. And who should show up at that Oscar party but Peter Jackson?
Oh, no
After,
way.
yeah, after the Oscars ended, and Richard Taylor, who
Uh-huh.
handled a lot of the special effects,
Hmm.
and they not only and in McKellen as well, and they
Oh,
showed
wow.
up carrying their Oscars. I remember Richard Taylor specifically, and handed them around to people in the room and set them on a pool table and chit chatted with the people. So those relationships, that incredible kind of like what is happening kind of feeling, developed over the years, and made some connections. So I missed the filming of the Lord of the Rings,
Mm.
which was, terrible, but
Hmm.
not everybody did from the One Ring. But when the Hobbit films rolled around, I had then been helping, volunteering, writing, doing a lot of events, public events like FanX in Salt Lake City, except in Atlanta or at San Diego Comic Con, all kinds of things. So I had developed enough of a relationship to know people in Peter Jackson's circle. And I got myself on a plane and said, "Hey, can we just have a meeting to talk about, things while you're
Hmm.
filming The Hobbit?" And they introduced me to Pete, was down on the South Island, and they said, uh, I'm from Salt Lake City. They first set me in a tent next to a woman, a linguist from Salt Lake City, which was crazy, from
Oh,
the
wow.
University of
Small
Utah.
world.
It was insane. But at lunchtime, they took me to meet Pete on a bridge. Hey, Pete, whatever. We talked for a minute, and he just invited me right then and there, like, hey, you should really come watch this film.
Hmm.
So
So
details to go.
you're standing on a bridge with Peter Jackson, having a conversation, and he just says, "Why don't you come see what we're doing? Why don't you
Yeah.
come hang out with us for a while?"
Yep.
Wow, that
Yep. He
that
said, "You're
blows my
really
mind.
me too." Still,
Do you ever find yourself thinking about who would win in a fight between Goku and Superman? Hi, I'm James Gavsey, and on the Who Would Win show, me and my co-host Ray ignore anything important happening in the outside world and debate fictional battles between characters from comics, movies, and video games.
We got a new show every week, and almost always am I the winner.
Yeah, not true, Ray.
In the past, we've discussed such matches as Captain America versus Darth Vader, Solid Snake versus the Iron Giant, classic matchups like RoboCop versus Terminator, and even the Muppets versus Sesame Street.
That one was crazy. So if you're a fan of geek culture and love a spirited debate, check out the Who Would Win show wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out at whowouldwinshow.com.
they were filming at the time, like moving around New Zealand, filming
Uh-huh.
like on location. So he said, when we get, and I actually think there was a journalist that was going with them a little bit at the time, and I'm sure he didn't want us both to be on top of each other. But he said, when
Mhm.
we're done with this, when we're in the studio, you should come stay. So he talked to the studio, and I talked to the studio, and I was invited to the set for
Oh, wow.
like 5 or 6 weeks, and was there every single day observing and living in Wellington, New Zealand, while that happened. And then,
Oh my goodness. So what did you do? You were just hanging out in the studio, like,
they have it's the Peter Jackson, it's the studio system that the Lord of the Rings built, being
mhm,
used to make The Hobbit and
mhm.
King Kong and some other films. So there's lots of sound stages there. Maybe not quite, at least from the outside, the same as like Hollywood sound stages, but inside, like super functional,
Mhm.
super amazing, high technology. Some were wet. They have entire like Lake Town in the Hobbit movies. Portions of it were in a wet set built there in a
Oh,
place.
wow.
So I was given free reign, just like, here's your pass, man. Have a good time. We'll see you at
Oh, no
lunch.
way.
Yeah, I mean, really insane. And the studio approved it. And look, I had earned some trust, right? So I wasn't
Mhm,
just,
mhm.
not like we were best friends, but I wasn't an absolute stranger either. And so
Right.
they did trust me with a camera and with a notepad and with a recorder. And um, they kind of said, like, hey, good luck to you. Uh,
Okay.
Here you go. And so it
Wow.
was up to me to make friends and um, interview people and set up interviews and spend 5 weeks observing, but also
Mhm.
interviewing. And so I did that from everybody from, hair and makeup to um, the guys building sets overnight to actors, actresses, stunt people who were always in costume, which I couldn't recognize if they were sitting right there because I only knew them as orcs.
Ah, uh-huh.
Um, but just everybody on set, I went to great pains to kind of understand from top to bottom the whole operation. And people were great. People were pretty amazing to me.
Yeah. So which of the actors or actresses were you able to actually interview? Let's throw it down to one. Who was the best to interview? Who was the most engaging?
I pretty much interviewed all of them. Like, there's almost without exception. Um, Lee Pace, who played Thranduil, the Elven King,
Hmm.
is an amazing interview, actually. It's just super smart, super thoughtful. Oftentimes when me or anyone, when you interview actors or actresses, but I mean, look, their main job is to be an actor or an actress. Their main
Mm-hmm.
job isn't to maybe answer questions, especially about their life or about their work.
Mm-hmm.
And they get asked the same questions over and over and over.
Right.
So that's a challenge for them. It's a challenge for journalists. It's just how it is. But when you ask Lee Pace a question, like that guy, maybe he's acting, but he really internalizes that question and really thinks about it, and then really looks you in the eye as a person, not as I'm on a different level, and really answers thoughtfully.
Hmm.
Amazing, actually, and he's really an intelligent person. So he was a great interview. That's who jumps out in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember his performance in the Hobbit movies I mean, we talked about depth earlier, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Thranduil, what a complex character there who in the book doesn't even get a name, right?
right.
He gets a name later on when Tolkien writes The Lord of the Rings, but what a performance that he did there in the Hobbit movies. That's awesome.
I remember he wasn't always on set. No one's always on set, and I didn't meet or see him for quite a long time, actually. I do remember the costume and the makeup people. He was like a legendary. Like they're like,
Mm.
wait until you see him. And I was a little skeptical. I'm skeptical about everything, but he was in person, in costume, on set, genuinely just magnificent. And then interviewing him, he was as real and human as could be. So it was pretty neat.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. There's an article that you wrote in 2006, right? So I'm going to take you back quite a few years. Let's go to 2006.
Wow, I
And
hope I remember.
to set the stage here, this was just a couple years after the Lord of the Rings films had come out. It was a couple of years before the Hobbit movies would come out, and I think at this time the the rumor going around was that they were still planning just two Hobbit movies. They hadn't yet decided on the three. And you wrote an article called "An Open Letter to New Line and MGM Regarding the Hobbit." And I'm gonna quote a paragraph there, and I think it's so true for the Hobbit. But what I want you to think about is, would you say the same to the studios of Rings of Power that you said to these studios regarding the Hobbit? So here's what you wrote. You said, while New Line and MGM hold the rights to make and distribute The Hobbit, we feel that we own it too. It is our story too. For many of us, it has been an old friend for decades. Not only is it part of our childhood, it is part of our adolescence and our adulthood. So take good care of our story, and we know from decades of experience and lots of readings, our story will take good care of you. If you trust it, so will its fans. Trust the story. For us, it is the character and heart that will lend this film magic and make it majestic.
Wow. Is it possible that I can be impressed by something I wrote? Because I
Absolutely.
like, hooray for me. I believe those words definitely now. I believe them about The Hobbit, and I definitely believe them about Rings of Power. Um, I think adapting Tolkien is hard. Making Rings of Power is hard. Making The Hobbit is hard. But I do think the key is right there, that there's a reason that you have this podcast. There's a reason why anyone talks about Tolkien. There's a reason why it resonates, or lots of reasons. But the story is to be trusted. I definitely agree with that. I agree with myself. What do you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So help me reconcile this, because I think some of the showrunners for the Rings of Power, and I'm not trying to be controversial here. I'm just kind of trying to look at a point critically. But the Amazon showrunners for Rings of Power, they've said to the effect of, we're trying to adapt the novel that Tolkien didn't write. And they picked a time in the Second Age Middle Earth where Tolkien wrote a few things. There was some skeleton. There were a couple of fleshed out stories. There were some characters like Galadriel who were established all throughout, but yet they've kind of deviated from Tolkien's story somewhat. So reconcile. Do you think Rings of Power has stayed true to the story of Tolkien? Have they deviated at all, or have they deviated too much? Kind of give us your thoughts on that.
Super complex. There's a few ways to approach adaptation, right? So there's no doubt that if you want to analyze Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings or his Hobbit, probably even more, there's no doubt that you will find just many discrepancies from the text to the film.
Mm-hmm.
But what he succeeded at, especially in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit maybe is debatable, but I would say parts of The Hobbit for sure, right? But what he succeeded at in Lord of the Rings is that it felt the same, right? So the adaptation maybe wasn't one-to-one literal, but the sort of the feeling, and not for everyone. There's plenty of people who will nitpick this, but the success of the film speaks pretty loudly that artistically they worked for Tolkien fans.
Mm-hmm.
Peter's adaptation felt right. So with Rings of Power, you can say, oh, we've dotted some I's and we've crossed our T's, and this is true to the lore. And sometimes, by the way, I've read a lot of criticism of Rings of Power, and I think some of it's fair and some of it's not. Sometimes it's been criticized for getting things wrong that it got right. Like, because maybe the showrunners maybe know an obscure reference or an obscure fact that the audience doesn't. Well, so they technically got something right, but it felt wrong to the audience. And so it's really tricky because you kind of want to do both things. And it's hard work to do. So did Rings of Power deviate? I think it did. I think they chose the right era. I'm no one cares, but I know that at conventions and on panels that I said they should do the Fall of Numenor. Like, I 100% think that's the right kind of thing to pick, and that's what they're doing. But here's where I don't think they got it right. I don't think that season 1 should have probably been focused on a who done it. So it felt very much like, well, who is Sauron? We have to.
Yep.
What's the mystery? That's, to me, and who is Gandalf and who are these wizards? Like, I don't think that's the right questions to be asking in the series. So yeah, I think they kind of got that wrong. I'm really happy that there's season 2 and they can correct the ship, and that's a luxury you don't have in movies, right? And it's clear. I don't know how much you or your audience follows like the day-to-day Rings of Power. I do and I don't, but there's a lot of changes from season 1 to season 2, a lot of changes, which is a pretty good signal that the studio or fans or both, or the showrunners themselves, feel like, well, we didn't get everything right. I think it's pretty clear they didn't. And it's, look, if people love it, hooray. I'm glad when people love things, like you should. Again, if I was in charge, it would have been different, and I feel like they didn't quite get the feeling right, whatever else, even if they got the facts right. Where there are some beautiful like shots of Numenor, the island where men live. There were some beautiful shots of Middle Earth. There were some great ideas. There were great sequences. There were lots of things to love, but overall it didn't quite feel right to me. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love how you say, they got some things right, but there was a feeling that was missing, right? It didn't feel quite right. And even if it was some obscure lore reference that was portrayed that most people missed, if it's not adapted well or it has that feeling, then it can be off.
Yeah.
And I look at one example. I was actually just thinking about this the other day. Just this will reveal how nerdy I am. But you look at the troll fights. I just read in the Fellowship of the Ring, the chapter on Moria, where they kind of fight the troll. Like, it's not that big of a deal. It's kind of done in a couple of sentences. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But then you look at Peter Jackson's movie, the Fellowship movie, and this is a really big thing. It takes the whole Fellowship, several attempts to bring that troll down. And then you compare that with Galadriel working on that snow troll, I think in like what was that, like episode 1 of Rings of Power.
Yeah.
And it's missing something. Like, yes, we know Galadriel is athletic. We know that she's a great a warrior, but there's something that's just missing when you contrast those two scenes from each other. There's some depth or some feeling, and I've really struggled to articulate, like, what is it that Rings of Power is missing? that makes me, I want to love it. I want to love it so bad. And I'm totally fine. I understand it's an adaptation. Like I'm not looking for like a one-to-one exact scene thing, but I've really struggled to articulate like why can't I just fall in love with Rings of Power like I did with the Peter Jackson movies?
I actually have some thoughts. Like you've hit some really fascinating things. So if I go and watch either emotionally or clinically, if I watch the whole of Peter Jackson's three films, there's like a 20-minute segment which is perfect, I think. Perfect cinema, which is pretty rare. And you just highlighted what it is.
We're not done yet. If you like this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right back.
The troll scene is part of it, but there's that sequence from when they get into Moria to when they get out of Moria, and it's about 20 minutes. But it's about as good as filmmaking gets. Like, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a slightly dated, some effects or whatever, but it doesn't matter.
It ages well, though.
Yeah. Oh, it's pretty incredible. And the emotional content carries you through. It doesn't really matter. But that segment is phenomenal. And it like, I'm not gonna like pretend Pete Jackson and I like trade Christmas cards, but like I feel like I know him a bit. I've talked to him pretty extensively, and I've watched his films extensively. And what he does, what I think his strength is highlighted in that section. And part of it is what you said about the troll. The troll in Peter Jackson's film, like, we connect with him. We understand his motives. We feel like we're watching this intelligent being, and like, as he plays cat and mouse with Frodo, it's like, it's nutty how connected we are to this alien monster we should have no connection to. He's really good at monsters. He's really good at action sequences. Like, really good. And it's really good storytelling. So unfairly, like, it's really hard for Rings of Power, but like, that's a guy who at those things is as good as anyone in probably in the world. Like, it's world-class storytelling with monsters and with action sequences, because it's not just simple action sequences. Another example, if you go watch the King Kong movies, which some people hate, not movies, some people don't like, some people do. There's an action sequence with Kong and some T-Rexes and some vines, and they kind of fall down. Whatever
I remember that, yeah.
Whatever you want to say about the films, that sequence, that segment is amazing. It's pretty amazing. It's Peter Jackson doing what he does very best. So Rings of Power has to tackle a troll, and it's not fair maybe that you and I compared like that Fellowship troll sequence to the Galadriel troll sequence, but it's also inevitable. Like, we have that context. It's there. It's really hard to be as good as that, and it's not as good as that. So then I can get straight to some real criticism. I think the choice to make Galadriel a strong woman doesn't have to mean that she's a strong, like, combatant. Like, that's not the same thing. There's lots of ways to be a strong character without being like the best badass swordsman in the world or something. But they chose to make it like really visual and really like combative, and I don't know, that's maybe not the most subtle approach. And I actually, in that troll sequence, I kind of felt sorry for the troll. Like, did you have to kill that thing? Did you have to be merciless? Because I didn't have a feeling of who the troll was. He just was like this thing in a cold cavern, and they just hurry and kill him really quick.
Like, they showed up at his home and killed him and then left. Wow, that does put a different light to that.
So Rings of Power has the burden of being compared to, like, the 20-minute greatest action sequence in fantasy film, and it's really hard to do. And those guys are really inexperienced. The showrunners were really inexperienced, and that's pretty hard. Let's hope they get better at things. I'm sure they're better at things. I'm confident they'll be better. But that's a really tough, tall order. But also, I agree with you. It's lacking that kind of feeling, that sort of connection. I, like you, wanted desperately to love all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've brought up the showrunners. They are rather inexperienced in their filmmaking, and who am I to speak? I've never made a film or convinced
Right.
Amazon to give me billions of dollars to make a film. But I do want to trust, like I've read what they've said, and I can tell that they love Tolkien. That they
No doubt.
know him and they love him, but there's still some disconnect between having a passion for Tolkien and being able to funnel that into some sort of a cinema adaptation of Tolkien. And I was getting really worried with some of the marketing before season one, and my confidence was just kind of plummeting. And then they had that big fan event where they brought in a few influencers. And I remember Corey Olson, I think his name is, the Tolkien professor, had
Mhm.
gone over there and he had asked them, like, what are the themes of Tolkien that most enliven you or most engage you or something to that effect. And he said, I don't even know if he's actually said what their answer was, but he said that their answer brought him to tears, that it was a pretty emotional thing for him. So that for me was like, okay, I guess I will trust these showrunners. But after season one, I'm still like, I don't know, guys. I'm cheering for you, but come on, like we gotta drive this home a little bit more. So I'm really hoping that season two will kind of that they'll have come into their own a little bit, that they've learned a few lessons, and that can really bring us into the second age of Middle Earth and help us feel enchanted, rather than simply having us suspend our disbelief.
Yeah, agree with all those things. And here's an insight for your audience that, like, I don't think people want to talk about this, but it's real, and I'm in the middle of it, and I'll talk about it. So when Warner Brothers decides I should go live in New Zealand for 5 weeks, right?
Hmm.
And Pete is like personally kind to me, like, right, like this movie director is like, "Hey,
Hmm.
Larry, how's it going?" Um, and then, what? Here's a side effect. One of the actors in the film, his parents were on set, and so we were like around each other a lot. Well, we got to be really close friends. So I can't. It's impossible for me not to have a like skewed perception of that actor and that experience and that movie set. So I'm compromised. There's no doubt about it. And so Corey Olson, I don't at all doubt his character or sincerity, but he and all those influencers that you mentioned and whoever got to go get a behind the scenes
Mm.
glimpse and
Hmm.
talk to people and sit in a room with them. And like you just said, those guys are sincere. I totally believe the filmmakers, the showrunners want to do the best possible job. So when you're in that room with them, you can't help but feel that.
Yeah,
But the studio is very aware that we can spend a little money and get some guys in a room, and this personality will rub
make some
off, and
connections. Hmm.
it's impossible not to be compromised. So,
Yeah,
and then you and me are at home in front of our TV. It's a totally different experience, and it can't be helped.
it's
And that's
true.
been going
It's
on for
true.
as long as there's been movie critics. That's just how it is. But what it means to be behind the scenes, you get compromised, including me.
Yeah, absolutely. You develop those personal connections and you become quite biased to those
Yes.
people. And
Yep.
yeah, that's fantastic. Well, Larry, why don't we wrap up with you tell us, out of all of the world of Tolkien, from the Silmarillion to the Hobbit to Unfinished Tales to Lord of the Rings, who is your favorite character and why?
I was afraid that was going to be an impossible question.
It's a hard one.
But I always gravitated towards Gimli in Fellowship of the Ring.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. He, there's, he, by the way, never tried to take the ring, which has something to do with dwarves.
Hmm.
Tolkien had these ideas, like even the dwarves who were compromised by rings just wanted gold,
Right.
right? They didn't
Hmm.
necessarily want to take over the world.
Hmm.
But I loved grim and stodgy and stable Gimli, and I didn't actually always love Gimli in the film adaptation. Being the butt of jokes was not my
Hmm.
favorite outcome
Right.
for that character, but like for no real reason than like what you like when you're 8 or 14. But I always really enjoyed Gimli, and by the way, in Rings of Power, I loved. This is one of the things I loved. I loved seeing the
Hmm.
deeper peer into dwarven culture. in
Yes.
Middle Earth.
Yes.
Like those scenes were my favorite scenes mostly.
Yes. Hmm.
But that for no real reason. Maybe I think of myself as a dwarf. I can't really put my finger on it, but that's the guy I was cheering from, and that's part of the reason why I would go look in the appendices to find out, well, what did happen to Gimli? Like what that's I just wanted to know more. Like what was it like to live in caves, and what even in the Hobbit, like they had the opportunity to go into dwarf lore a bit, especially kind of some of the wars that dwarves had
Right.
with goblins and orcs, and you know, Pete, in my opinion, that they kind of swung and missed.
Yeah.
They could have done some things better in the Hobbit, but those are, for whatever reason, I cannot explain to you, but that emotionally he connected with me, and kind of dwarves connected with me in Tolkien's Middle Earth.
I love that you say that. I was actually really surprised that you said Gimli. I didn't think you were going to say that, and a few thoughts come to mind as that. I mean, you've mentioned you're a journalist. You've done a lot of creation of stories. You've written a lot of articles about Lord of the Rings. You have a podcast about Lord of the Rings, and so you are essentially engaging in this idea of what Tolkien called, or I don't know if Tolkien called it, but it was sort of his thinking of sub-creation, right?
Yes.
That there is this creation, and then we work within that, and we create even more within that. And that is really interesting when you look at who created the dwarves. It was Aule of the Valar,
Yes.
who he's the craftsman, he's the creator, and he's the one who's building things within this world and within Middle Earth. And so you love Gimli for a lot of different reasons. Maybe one of them, and I'm just shooting up from the cuff here, is that sub-creation that comes from that creator of the dwarves. Who knows?
Well, you have to let me comment. I think that's really insightful. I think you might be right on. And sub-creation to me is one of the great aspects of Tolkien's work, and it is why the adaptation doesn't have to be perfect for me to appreciate it, right? Because there's some level of that creation, and as much as Tolkien wanted people to like adapt his works with care and respect, I also think that there's room for some interpretation for sure. And me being watching the sub-creation of The Hobbit, like I went home and went to film school to learn how to tell stories and create. And
wow.
I'm constantly kind of under the current grind. Like I work as a journalist, and I go home and work on movie scripts and make short films like that.
That's fun.
Creation. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to look, if I could, I would say I would like to make the Silmarillion for HBO.
Yes.
That's what I want
Yes.
to do. The Tolkien estate wouldn't let me, but I'm the guy. I should be doing that. That's also partly why, like, it's totally unfair for me to criticize Rings of Power, because this part of my brain is like, Larry, you should be that showrunner, which is
Yeah.
absurd. But I just said it's absurd. Also, I'm like, well, but kind of, yeah. So I don't know. But yeah, it's good. Like, that's good self-insight that I need to think about. Why do I like Gimli? Sub-creation. Aule. Yeah, that's a good answer.
That's beautiful. Well, Larry, thank you for joining us. This has been a real treat for me. And thanks for joining us on the Lord of the Rings podcast.
100% my pleasure. Thanks so much. I really appreciate talking to you.
My friends, if you enjoyed this episode, let me know by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing with your friends. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Lore of the Rings Podcast. For feedback on the show, please email me using the link in the show notes. Until next Thursday, remember, not all those who wander are lost.